were the last, because before you know it, time goes past and life's just not that long. Tell all you love that you love them so, because even if you do, they might not know, and one day we'll all be gone. Taste the wind, don't let it blow on by. Sing songs of love, let the music get you high. And when it's said and done, you'll know the sun will shine on. Learn all you can.
I highly recommend this book that came out last year, Caste, C-A-S-T, by the African-American woman author Isabel Wilkerson. Out of the many powerful books about the massive horrors that black people have suffered for over 400 years in the United States under slavery and brutal white supremacy, I consider this book the best. I urge you to read all of it. The townspeople of the East Texas village of Leesburg hammered a buggy axle into the ground to serve as a stake. And then they chained 19-year-old Wiley McNeely to it. They collected the kindling they would use for the fire at the base of his feet. Despite his protestations of innocence in connection to the white girl they said he had assaulted. 500 people gathered that fall in 1921, 100 years ago, to see Wiley McNeely burned to death in front of them. But first, the leaders of the lynching had to settle a matter of importance. The leaders drew lots to see who would get which piece of McNeely's body after they had burned him alive. Figure out the body parts which they regarded as the choicest souvenir. This they did in front of the young man facing his final seconds on this earth. And there, chained up and left to hear of the disposition of his fingers and ears to the men who had kidnapped him outside of the law. The leaders debated this in front of the 500 people who had come to watch him die and who were impatient for the festivities to begin. And after the men had decided, and after all was settled, they lit the match. The little girls appeared to be in grade school in light cotton dresses with a sailor's collar and their hair cut in precise page boys just below their ears. And in the picture, the two younger girls seemed to be fidgeting in shadow close to the women in the group who were perhaps their mothers or aunts. The girl you notice first, though, looks to be about 10 years old, positioned at the front of the group of grown-ups and children, her eyes alert and riveted. A man is at her side, crisp in his tailored white pants, white shirt, white Panama hat, as if headed to cocktail hour at a boating party, his arms folded, face at rest, unperturbed, vaguely bored. It is July 19th, 1935. They're all standing at the base of a tree in the pine woods of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Above them hangs the limp body of Reuben Stacy, his overalls torn and bloodied, riddled with bullets, his hands cuffed in front of him, head snapped from the lynching rope, killed for frightening a white woman. The girl in the front is looking up at the dead black man with wonderment rather than horror, a smile of excitement on her face as if show ponies had just galloped past her at the circus. The fascination on her young face, set against the gruesome nature of the gathering, was captured by a photographer and is among the most widely circulated of all lynching photographs of 20th century America. Lynchings were part carnival, part torture chamber, and attracted thousands of onlookers who collectively became accomplices to public sadism. Photographers who were tipped off in advance and installed portable printing presses at the lynching sites to sell to lynchers and onlookers like photographers at a prom. They made postcards out of the gelatin prints for people to send to their loved ones. People mailed postcards of the severed, half-burned head of Will James atop a pole in Cairo, Illinois in 1907. They sent postcards of burned torsos that looked like the petrified victims of Vesuvius. Only these horrors had come at the hands of human beings in modern times. Some people framed the lynching photographs with locks of the victim's hair under glass, if they had been able to secure any. One spectator wrote on the back of his postcard from Waco, Texas in 1916, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left with the cross over it. Your son, Joe." This was singularly American. Time magazine wrote many years later, even the Nazis did not stoop to selling souvenirs of Auschwitz. Lynching postcards were so common a form of communication in turn of the 20th century America that lynching scenes became a burgeoning subdepartment of the postcard industry. By 1908, the trade had grown so large, and the practice of sending postcards featuring the victims of mob murderers had become so repugnant that the U.S. Postmaster General banned the cards from the mails. But the new edict did not stop Americans from sharing their lynching exploits. From then on, they merely put the postcards in an envelope. In downtown Omaha, they started a bonfire and readied it for Will Brown. The newspapers had advertised the lynching in advance, and as many as 15,000 people gathered on the courthouse square that day in September 1919 So many people that one cannot make out the faces in the human sea in a wide shot taken from above. These thousands of dots on a gelatin print, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, nephews, brothers, teenagers, were of one mind, had fused into an organism onto itself, intent on a single mission, not only to kill, but to humiliate, torture, and incinerate another human being, and together to breathe in the smoke of burning flesh. 2 days before, a white woman and her boyfriend had said that a black man had molested her when the couple were out on the town. No one alive knows what happened for sure, and there were questions even then. Resentment had been building against the influx of black Southerners arriving north during the Great Migration from the South. And Will Brown, a packing house worker, was the man the sheriffs arrested. There was no investigation, no due process. That day, the mob looted guns from the local pawn shops and general stores and fired on the courthouse where Brown had been detained. Before they could even get to him, the mob killed 2 of their own, a bystander and a fellow rioter, with their ragged gunshots. They set the courthouse on fire to force the sheriff to hand Brown over to them. They cut the water hoses to keep the firefighters from putting out the blaze. And when the mayor tried to appeal to the mob, the leaders put a rope around his neck and inflicted injuries that put him in the hospital. The leaders of the mob pulled Brown from the rooftop of the courthouse, where the courthouse workers had escaped from the fire and where the prisoners had been taken. And then the people in the mob began the task for which they had gathered. First, they stripped Will Brown, and those up front fought each other to beat him. They hoisted him, half-conscious, onto a lamppost outside the courthouse, and then they fired bullets into his dangling body, cheering as they fired. And it was from these gunshots that the coroner said Brown died. They burned his body in the bonfire they had made on the courthouse square. And then they tied the body to a police car and dragged the corpse through the streets of Omaha. They cut the pieces of rope they had used to hoist him, and these they sold as keepsakes for people's display cabinets and fireplace mantles. The photographers on the scene captured the lynching from different angles and produced postcards of the men in business suits and teenagers in newsboy hats, posing as if at a wedding reception. Crowding into the frame above the charred torso, sparks of fire amid the ash, an image they would send to cousins and in-laws and former neighbors around the country. A 14-year-old boy was helping his father at his printing plant across the street from the courthouse in the middle of the riot. And the boy's name was Henry Fonda, who became the well-known actor. And he would leave Omaha when he grew up and make a name for himself as a leading man in Hollywood. That evening in 1919, against the hollers of the mob and the man hanging from a lamppost and the cinders of the bonfire, Fonda and his father locked the plant and drove home in silence. He would say years later, when he was an old man, it was the most horrendous sight I have ever seen. The decades had not swept the ash from his memory. It was perhaps no coincidence that he would appear in many movies in which he was the moral voice, calling for a life to be spared. In the 1943 film, The Oxbow Incident, about vigilante violence, it is Fonda's character who warns a blood-lusting mob, man just naturally can't take the law into his own hands and hang people without hurting everybody in the world. Why didn't I hear these wrenching, horrible stories in American history when I went to high school in the early 1960s in Illinois? In the mid-1830s in Grand Gulf, Mississippi, white men burned a black man alive and stuck his head on a pole at the edge of town for all to see as a lesson to men in the subordinate caste. In other words, black people at the bottom of society. The black man had been tortured and beheaded after he stood up and killed the dominant caste man, a white man, quote, who owned his wife and was in the habit of sleeping with her, unquote, according to a contemporaneous account. As he faced death for taking an extreme and assuredly suicidal step to protect his wife in that world, the doomed husband said that he believed he should be rewarded in heaven for it. More than a century later, in December 1943, an earnest 15-year-old boy named Willie James Howard was working during the holiday school break at a dime store in Live Oak, Florida. He was an only child, and having made it to the 10th grade, was expected to exceed what anyone else in the family had been able to accomplish. And that December, he made a fateful gesture, unknowing or unmindful, of a central pillar of caste. In other words, these levels of society that people are forced into, whites on top, blacks on the bottom, and other groups in between. This 15-year-old boy, was hopeful and excited about his new job, and wanted so badly to do well that he sent Christmas cards to everyone at work. In one Christmas card, the one to a girl his age named Cynthia, who worked there, and whom he had a crush on, he signed with L for love. It would seem an ordinary gesture for that time of the year, sweet even, but this was Jim Crow South. The boy was black, the girl was white. She showed the card to her father. Word got back to Willie James that his card had somehow disturbed her. So on New Year's Day, 1944, he hand-delivered an apologetic note trying to explain himself. I know you don't think much of our kind of people, but we don't hate you. All we want is to be your friends. But you won't let us. Please, don't let anybody else see this. I hope I haven't made you mad. He added a rhyme. I love your name. I love your voice. For a SH, for sweetheart, you are my choice. The next day, the girl's father and two other white men dragged Willie James and his father to the banks of the Suwannee River. They hog-tied Willie James, held a gun to his head. They forced him to jump and forced his father at gunpoint to watch him drown. Held captive and outnumbered as a father was, he was helpless to save his only child. The men admitted to authorities that they had abducted the boy and bound his hands and feet. They said he just jumped and drowned on his own. Within days, the boy's parents fled for their lives. A young Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP alerted the Florida governor to no avail. The NAACP Field Secretary Harry T. Moore managed to convince the boy's parents to overcome their terror and to sign affidavits about what had happened the day their son was killed. A local grand jury refused to indict the boy's abductors, and federal prosecutors would not intervene. No one was ever held to account or spent a day in jail for the death of Willie James. His abduction and death were seen as upholding the caste order, whites on top, blacks on bottom. Thus, the terrors of the Southern caste system continued, carried forth without penalty, sanctioned as it was by the U.S. government. The caste system had become not simply Southern, but American. In the United States, the subordinate caste was quarantined in every sphere of life, made untouchable on American terms for most of the country's history and well into the 20th century. In the South, where most people in the subordinate caste were long consigned, black children and white children studied from separate sets of textbooks. In Florida, the books for black children and white children could not even be stored together. African Americans were prohibited from using white water fountains, had to drink from horse troughs. in the southern swelter before the era of separate fountains. In southern jails, the bed sheets for the black prisoners were kept separate from the bed sheets for the white prisoners. All private and public human activities were segregated from birth to death. From hospital wards to railroad platforms, to ambulances, hearses, cemeteries. In stores, black people were prohibited from trying on clothing, shoes, hats, or gloves, assuming they were permitted in the store at all. If a black person happened to die in a public hospital, the body will be placed in a corner of the dead house away from white corpses, wrote the historian Bertram Doyle in 1937. This pillar of caste was enshrined into law in the United States in 1896 after a New York man challenged an 1890 Louisiana law that separated the white and colored races, as they were called, in railroad cars. Louisiana had passed the law after the collapse of Reconstruction and the return of power to the former Confederates, the former slave owners. A committee of concerned citizens of color came together, raised money to fight the law in court. On the appointed day, June 7th, 1892, Homer A. Plessy, a shoemaker who looked white but was categorized as black under the American definition of race, bought a first-class ticket from New Orleans to Covington on the East Louisiana Railroad, took his seat in the whites-only car. In that era, a person of ambiguous racial origin was presumed not to be white. If they couldn't figure out if you were white or black, then you were assumed to be black. So the conductor ordered him to the colored car. Plessy refused, was arrested, as the committee had anticipated. His case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled 7-1 in favor of Louisiana's separate but equal law. Do we wonder why many black people have no trust in the legal system, in the laws of this country? It set in motion nearly 7 decades of formal state-sanctioned isolation and exclusion of one caste from the other, whites from blacks, in the United States. In Southern courtrooms, even the so-called Word of God was segregated. There were 2 separate Bibles, one for blacks, one for whites, to swear to tell the truth on. The same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. This pillar of purity, as with the others, endangered the lives of the people in the subordinate caste, those at the bottom, the blacks. And one day in the 1930s, a black railroad switchman was working in Memphis, slipped, fell beneath a switch engine. He lay bleeding to death, his right arm and leg severed. According to reports of the incident, ambulances rushed to the man's aid. They took one look, saw that he was a Negro, and backed away. The waters and shorelines of nature were forbidden to the subordinate castes, black people, if the dominant caste, whites, so desired. And well into the 20th century, African Americans were banned from white beaches and lakes and pools, both north and south, lest they pollute them. This was a sacred principle in the United States well into the second half of the 20th century, even after 1950. And the dominant caste went to great lengths to enforce it. In the early 1950s, when Cincinnati agreed under pressure to allow black swimmers into some of its public pools, whites, get this, whites threw nails and broken glass into the water to keep them out. In the 1960s, a black civil rights activist tried to integrate a public pool by swimming a lap and then emerging to towel off. The legal historian Mark S. Weiner said, the response was to drain the pool entirely and refill it with fresh water. Decades before, in 1919, a black boy paid with his life and set off a riot in Chicago for inadvertently breaching this pillar of caste. 17-year-old Eugene Williams was swimming in Lake Michigan at a public beach on the city's south side and happened to wade past the imaginary line that separated the races, blacks from whites. He unknowingly passed into the white water, which flowed into and looked no different from the black water. He was stoned and drowned to death for doing so. The tensions over the breaching of boundaries that summer incited the dominant caste, the whites, and set off one of the worst race riots in U.S. history. In the decades after, in middle American places like Newton, Kansas, Marion, Indiana, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, people in the upper caste rose up in hysterics at the sight of a subordinate caste person, blacks, approaching their water. In August 1931, a new public park opened in Pittsburgh with pools the size of a football field and big enough for 10,000 swimmers. But soon afterward, as the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported, quote, each Negro who entered the pool yesterday was immediately surrounded by whites and slugged or held beneath the water until he gave up his attempts to swim and left, unquote. In the summer of 1949, the city of St. Louis had what was considered the largest city pool in the country at its fairground park. And when the city, under pressure from black citizens, took up the issue of allowing black people into the pool, the backlash was immediate. A man who happened to have the same name as the official in charge of integrating the pool required police protection due to the mistaken threats against him. Lifeguards considered quitting in protest. The day the first African Americans arrived to swim, a crowd gathered with knives, bricks, and bats. They set upon the black children who had come to swim, forcing them to walk a gauntlet, striking and taunting them. The mob grew to 5,000 people who chased after any black person they saw approaching the park. Children on bicycles, a man stepping off a streetcar, a truck stalled in traffic, a black man on a porch at a house next to the park. They kicked him as he lay on the ground, limp and bleeding. The town of Newton, Kansas went to the state Supreme Court to keep black people out of the pool it built in 1935. The city and its contractor argued that black people could never be permitted in the pool, not on alternate days, not at separate hours, not ever, because of the type of pool it was. They told the court that it was a circulatory type of pool in which the water is only changed once during the swimming season. White people, they argued, would not go into water that had touched black skin. The only way white residents would swim in a pool after blacks, wrote the historian Jeff Wiltsey, was if the water was drained and the tank scrubbed. The operators couldn't do all that every time a black person went into the pool, so they banned black people altogether. The court sided with the city, and for decades more, the town's only public pool remained for the exclusive use of the dominant caste, white people. A public pool outside Pittsburgh solved this problem by keeping black people out until after the season was over in September, which meant it was closed to black swimmers at the precise time that they or anyone else would have wanted to use it. The manager said this was the only way the maintenance crew could get sufficient time to properly cleanse and disinfect it after the Negroes have used it. A white woman in Marion, Indiana, seemed to be speaking for many in the dominant caste across America when she said that white people wouldn't swim with colored people because they didn't want to be polluted by their blackness. Far from her in Elizabeth, New Jersey, whites blocked African Americans at the stairwells and entrances the week the city first allowed black swimmers to its public pool. There and elsewhere, every black swimmer that entered the water quite literally risked his or her life. Well into the 20th century, a panic could afflict people in the dominant caste, whites, if ever a breach occurred. A frantic white mother in civil rights era Mississippi yanked her young daughter inside one day, held her over the kitchen sink, and scrubbed her little hand with a Brillo pad as if both their lives depended on it. The girl had touched the hand of a little black girl who was working on the family's land. The mother told her never to touch that girl's hand again, though that was not the term she used. They have germs, the mother said. They're nasty. The mother's fury frightened the little girl, brought her to tears as they stood there, bent over the sink. And the daughter's tears brought the mother to tears over the manufactured terror she had allowed to consume her, and over the box that she realized in that moment had imprisoned her, the mother, for all of her life. This was a sacred prohibition, and it was said that into the 1970s, the majority of whites in the South had not so much as shaken the hands of a black person. A young dominant caste man, white man, raised in the Depression-era South, had been well taught the rules of the caste system and had adhered to them as expected. And when he went north in the mid-20th century, joined the military, he had to confront the mythologies of his upbringing. The white Southerners said, "Strange things pop up at us like gargoyles when we are liberated from our delusions." Up north, on occasion, he found himself in situations where black people were permitted in the same work settings as whites. The man and editor at Look magazine remembered years later, "I thought I was entirely prepared emotionally and intellectually, but he discovered that he was a captive of his own conditioning, which he called a certain madness, an insanity. Every time he reached the point where he had to shake hands with a black person, he felt an automatic revulsion that had been trained into him. He recoiled even though it had been black women who had bathed him as a child. Black women had mixed the dough for his biscuits, and whose touch had not repulsed him when extended in servitude. In other words, as long as they were kept on the bottom, serving him and other white people, then it was okay, but not as equal human beings. But with presumed equals, he says, "Each time I shook hands with a Negro, I felt an urge to wash my hands. Every rational impulse, all that I considered best in myself, struggled against this urge." He knew this urge was wrong, but it had been planted there many years before when he was a child. But the hand that had touched the dark skin had a will of its own and would not be dissuaded from signaling it was unclean. This is what I mean by madness, the insanity of racism and the caste system. In America, slave auctions became public showcases for the dehumanization project of caste making. As the most valuable liquid assets in the land, combined, worth more than the land itself, these enslaved human beings, enslaved people were ordered to put on a cheery face to bring a higher profit to the dominant caste white sellers who were breaking up their families. Women were forced to disrobe before the crowd, to submit to hours of physical probing by roughhousing men who examined their teeth, their hands, or whatever other parts of their bodies the potential bidders decided to inspect. Their bodies did not belong to them, but to the dominant caste, the whites, to do whatever it wished and however it wished to do it. At auction, they were to answer any question put to them with a smiling, cheerful countenance, or be given 30 lashes for not selling themselves well enough to the seller's satisfaction. John Brown, a survivor of slavery who was sold away from his own mother and subjected to these scenes many times thereafter, remembered, when spoken to, these enslaved human beings must reply quickly and with a smile on their lips. Here may be seen husbands separated from their wives only by the width of the room, and children from their parents, one or both witnessing the driving of the bargain that is to tear them asunder forever. Yet not a word of lamentation or anguish, no sadness must escape from them, nor when the deed is consummated dare they bid one another goodbye or take one last embrace. They weren't even allowed to hug each other before they were separated forever. In Virginia, there were 71 offenses that carried the death penalty for enslaved people, but only imprisonment when committed by whites, such as stealing a horse or setting fire to bales of grain. Something, get this, something as ordinary to most humans as a father helping a son with his lessons was prohibited. A black father in Georgia could be flogged for teaching his own child to read. Free black people were forbidden to carry firearms, forbidden to testify against a white person, forbidden to raise a hand against a white person, even in defending themselves. Richmond, Virginia required that Negroes and mulattoes, those who were mixed white and black, must step aside when whites passed by and barred them from riding in carriages except in the capacity of menials, people not equal. Charleston slaves could not swear, smoke, walk with a cane, assemble at military parades, or make joyful demonstrations. In the United States, there developed two parallel worlds existing on the same plane with flagrant double standards to emphasize the purposeful injustices built into the system. This was all deliberate. It didn't just happen. It was to keep the whites on top and the blacks at the very bottom. The abolitionist minister, William Goodell, observed the quandary of black people in America before the war between the North and the South. He said in 1853, he, a black person, is accounted criminal for acts which are deemed innocent in others, punished with a severity from which all others are exempted. He's under the control of the law, though unprotected by the law, and can know the law only as an enemy. The law was an enemy to black people. Human history is rife with examples of inconceivable violence, and as Americans, we like to think of our country as being far beyond the guillotines of medieval Europe. And yet it was here that Native Americans were occasionally skinned, Native Americans skinned and made into bridal reins. Andrew Jackson, the U.S. president, incidentally, whom Donald Trump revered, Andrew Jackson oversaw the forced removal of Native people from their ancestral homelands during that Trail of Tears. He used bridal reins of indigenous flesh. Andrew Jackson, the U.S. president, used bridle reins of Native American flesh when he went horseback riding. And it was here that into the 20th century, African Americans were burned alive at the stake, as 17-year-old Jesse Washington was in Waco, Texas in 1916, before a crowd of thousands. The crimes of homicide, of rape, and of assault and battery were felonies in the slavery era, as they are today in any civil society. They were seen as wrong, immoral, reprehensible, worthy of the severest punishment. But the country allowed most any atrocity to be inflicted on the black body. And thus 12 generations of African Americans faced the ever-present danger of assault and battery, or worse, every day of their lives during the quarter millennium, about 250 years, of enslavement. Advertisements for runaways record a catalog of assaults upon them. A North Carolina enslaver took out an ad for the return of Betty and reported having burnt her with a hot iron on the left side of her face. He tried to make the letter M. A warden in Louisiana reported that he had just taken custody of a runaway and noted that, quote, he has been lately gelded and is not yet well, unquote. This one runaway enslaved man had been castrated. Another Louisiana reported his disgust for a neighbor who had castrated 3 men of his. An order from the justices went out in New Hanover County, North Carolina, in the search of a runaway named London, granting that any person may kill and destroy the said slave by such means as he or they may think fit. This casual disregard for black life and the deputizing of any citizen to take that life would become a harbinger of the low value accorded African Americans in the police and vigilante shootings of unarmed black civilians that continued into the early decades of the 21st century. It was during the era of enslavement that Americans in the South devised a range of horrors to keep human beings in the unnatural state of perpetual generational imprisonment. 14-pound chains and metal horns radiating 2 or 3 feet from the skull were locked onto the heads of people who tried to escape. Slave pens had flogging rooms in the attics where rows of wooden cleats for the reeving cords were screwed into the floor to tie people down for their floggings, for not speaking up, not looking bright and smart to their potential buyers. Every day there was a flogging going on, wrote John Brown, a survivor of slavery. The tortures were elaborate enough to be given names. One was called bucking, in which the person was stripped naked, hands and feet tied, forced into a sitting position around a stake, and rotated for 3 hours of flogging with a cowhide, as other enslaved people were forced to watch. The person was then washed down with salt and red pepper to make him suffer more. An enslaved man named John Glasgow was punished in this way for having slipped away to see his wife in another plantation. And then there was the picket, which involved iron cleats, pulleys, cords that formed the gallows along the crossbeam of a whipping post and the sharp end of a stake. John Glasgow suffered this too after attempting to see his wife again. His fellow captives were made to take turns whipping him or face the same punishment themselves. He was left to die or recover as might be, Brown said. It was a month before he stirred from his plank. 5 months more elapsed ere he could walk. Ever after he had a limp in his gait, in the way he walked. After slavery ended, the former Confederates took power again, but now without the least material investment in the lives of the people they once had owned. They pressed down even harder to keep the lowest caste in its place. African Americans were mutilated, hanged from poplars and sycamores, and burned at the courthouse square, a lynching every 3 or 4 days in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, 1900 to 1940. A slaveholder in North Carolina seemed to speak for the enforcers of caste throughout the world. Make them stand in fear, she said. I urge you, if you give a damn about fairness, about justice, about truth, about equality for all people, and you want to know the truth about the history of what black people have suffered in this country, I urge you to read all of this book, Caste, C-A-S-T. It came out last year, 2020, written by the African-American woman Isabel Wilkerson. Good night.
Live every day as if it were the last, because before you know it, time goes past and life's just not that long. Tell all you love that you love them so, because even if you do, they might not know, and one day we'll all be gone.